My name is Ben Abelow. I'm the author of a new short book called How the West Brought War to Ukraine. And I'll just read the subtitle because that will save a lot of time. The subtitle is Understanding How US and NATO Policies Led to Crisis, War, and the Risk of Nuclear Catastrophe. And unlike the mainstream narrative that's coming out of Washington or the European capitals, or that is being covered by much of the mainstream media, I'm arguing the case that the US and its NATO allies actually bears a great deal of culpability for what happened in this war. Obviously, it was the Russian military and the Russian Kremlin and Vladimir Putin who made the actual decision to go to war. So there's no question that in a proximal sense, this was a war that was that Vladimir Putin and the Russian Kremlin and the extent to which a single individual versus a military bureaucracy was actually involved in this is extremely hard to discern. But no question, Russia started this war, and no question that a lot of innocents have been killed as a result of that war. So I don't mean to be exonerating Russia, whatever, but what I do want to say is that while in a proximal sense the decision to go to war was made by Russia, the point I argue in this book is that when one is judging historical events, one must look beyond the immediate moment. One must go back in time and look at the entire set of events, events that may not be widely known or may have been at one point on the front pages, but now have been long forgotten and have not been incorporated into the current narrative by the media or by Washington. So in this book, I try to explain the ways in which I believe the US and its NATO allies played a large role in bringing this war about, and that I argue that there are many steps at which war could have been avoided, including right before the war started, had the US and NATO been willing to take certain steps. Now, what makes me say this? I'm not going to go into all the arguments, but basically, if one looks at the history of the last 30 years, starting with the end of the Soviet Union in around 1990, 1991, one finds the expansion of NATO, which is a Western military alliance, from West Germany toward Russia's borders and then actually to Russia's border. And there have been warnings from deep within the US establishment for decades that the movement of NATO and in general, even military alliances and forces that are not within NATO but are still Western bilateral and multilateral arrangements between the US or between other countries and moving towards Russia's border, that these are extremely dangerous and have been provocative. I'm going to give you I'm going to read a few passages from the book. To start with, I'm going to reference a man named George Kennan, who was in some ways probably the greatest and most prestigious living statesman at the time that the NATO expansion began. George Kennan was the developer of the very concept of containment by which the West tried to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union. And in the late 90s, when it first became clear that the US was definitely going to push for NATO expansion, Kennan wrote, why, this was actually part of an interview published in the New York Times, why, with all the hopeful possibilities engendered by the end of the Cold War, should East-West relations become centered on the question of who would be allied with whom, and by implication against whom, in some fanciful, totally unforeseeable, and improbable future military conflict. And a year after that, as it became really clear that NATO was going to expand, here's what Kennan said. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. It is a tragic mistake. There is no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anyone. This expansion would make the founding fathers turn over in his grave. And then Kennan added, don't people understand our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we're turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Now, it wasn't just Kennan. There were many others. For instance, Paul Nitzi, who was had been Secretary of Defense and also Secretary of the Navy. And not only that, but he viewed Kennan's policy of containment as way too benign. And he opposed Kennan's policy of static containment with an active, aggressive policy of rollback to push the Soviets out of territory. So I'm simply trying to establish his credentials as a military hawk. Paul Nitzi also was against this. Paul Nitzi, by the way, also was the main writer of NCS 68, NSC 68, National Security Council Memorandum 68, which basically established the Cold War on the U.S. side in terms of arguing that we had to be very aggressive towards the Soviets. Nitzi was against this. Robert McNamara, who developed and executed massive bombing campaigns of Vietnam, often seen as a quintessential hawk, was opposed to the expansion for these same sorts of reasons. Then in 2007, Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill was writing. Fiona Hill is often seen as a person who's, very fearful of the expansionism of Russia. She's very concerned, fearful, and thinks that we need to take very aggressive steps to contain Russia. She, in an interview she made with Politico, an online publication, right at the beginning of this war, she made reference to statements that were made by to discussions occurring in the National Intelligence Council. And this is the body that is the advisory body for the Director of National Intelligence, which is the executive director of the entire U.S. intelligence establishment. Hill, describing back what happened in 2007, wrote, "Back then," or this was an interview, she stated, "Back then I was a national intelligence officer, and the National Intelligence Council was analyzing what Russia was likely to do in response to the NATO Open Door Declaration." That was a declaration, by the way, during which NATO said they would bring Ukraine and Georgia, which are both located on Russia's border, into NATO. One of our assessments was that there was a real, genuine risk of some kind of preemptive Russian military action, not just defined to the annexation of Crimea, but some much larger action taken against Ukraine along with Georgia. And of course, 4 months later, after NATO's Bucharest summit, when NATO policy about Ukraine and Georgia were announced, there was the invasion of Georgia. There wasn't an invasion of Ukraine then because the Ukrainian government pulled back from seeking NATO membership. But we should have seriously addressed how we were going to deal with this potential outcome and our relations with Russia. So, many people draw in their mind a distinction between people who are extremely fearful and of possible Russian motivations, and they see them as, they couldn't have thought that NATO expansion played a role. And they draw a distinction in their mind between people who are maybe overly credulous about what the true motivations Russians are, and they see Russia as having responded to NATO expansion. And here I offer that as an example, not just of Kennan, Paul Nitzi, and Robert McNamara, but someone that after NATO expansion had begun, a person who is, a credentialed person who is very concerned about the motivations of Russia and who was deep on the inside in the National Intelligence Council at that time, stating quite clearly that the National Intelligence Council recognized the possibility that NATO expansion would cause this problem. Then in 2008, I'll just mention one other instance, William J. Burns, who is now the head of Mr. Biden's CIA, in 2008, he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. And with extensive contacts with the whole range of people within the Kremlin, he analyzed the threat that Russia felt in response to the expansion of NATO on its border. And he basically wrote a memo back to the U.S. It was a secret cable that went to Condoleezza Rice, who was then Secretary of State. This was ultimately released by WikiLeaks. And the title of his memo basically tells it all. Niet means niet, no means no. And the subtitle was something like, Russia's red lines about the expansion of NATO. And basically he laid out in this memo that Russia was going to react very adversely to NATO expansion. But nonetheless, the West, especially under the direction of the U.S., pushed forward with NATO expansion. Anyway, I wanted to make that as a general point, just to lay some of the framework that I think there are misconceptions about, that there was not widespread recognition that NATO expansion could be extremely dangerous and provocative to Russia. I'll say one more thing very briefly. You know, Ukraine is located right on Russia's western border. If you look back at the history of the Soviet Union, and before that, the history of Imperial Russia, let's start with the of Napoleon. You know, Russia was invaded from the west first by Napoleon, and then during World War I, and then during World War II by Nazi Germany. During World War II, the Nazi forces invaded deep, deep into Russia, and during that time, literally 1/7 of the entire Russian population died as a result of that invasion. This is a scale of death in response to an invasion from the West that the people in the U.S. can barely get their heads around. They can't even begin to imagine it. I mean, they can imagine it perhaps, but in terms of our own experience here in the U.S., this kind of deep history of invasion and encroachment, one has to keep in mind in terms of trying to understand how Russia might respond to the movement of Western military powers to their borders. And I'll just state very briefly before that, there were also assurances given to Russia, to Moscow, it was the Soviet Union at that time that the East and West Germany reunified, that the West would not move towards Russia's borders. That's a whole deep discussion, but I'll leave it at that. We have a situation where the U.S. basically went against assurances that it had given to Russia, not just the U.S., but many Western European countries. They moved forward in spite of the fact that multiple sources were opposed to this and felt it would provoke Russia. And then we have to keep in mind also that I would call it the psychological sensitivity of Russia to this kind of movement. And I think this is all very important background to understanding some other views about what Russia might have been doing when they invaded Ukraine.